Hello and welcome back to the STEM Idealistic Crusade. This video will be a very short and spoiler-free general impressions and essentially a review of The Batman, which was just released in theaters and has been making its way through the Batman fan base and just getting far more of a positive reception than I had anticipated. And I will admit that originally I had no intention on really bothering with this since the trailer seemed to indicate it was just going to essentially be going for a David Fincher 7 type gloss and probably adapt some Batman Year One type material with some Long Halloween material as well. It just didn't seem like it was going to do all that much, but once the film came out and at its long runtime, which was very off-putting, and I know has not reacted well. Well, people haven't reacted well to the 3-hour runtime, even in the screening I went to. It started getting very positive receptions from not just the Batman fan base, but general filmgoers as well. So it sort of piqued my interest, and some of the things I was hearing from the more dedicated fan channels about which elements of different comic runs they were pulling from started to really pique my interest. So since I got asked about it a lot, being a Batman fan and being a movie fanatic, I decided to just go ahead and go to my local theater and managed to catch it at one of the late shows. You can definitely get the feeling that the 3-hour runtime has its effect when people start snoring around you if you go to a later showtime. That was amusing. The film is, of course, 2 hours and 56 minutes, so indeed it pretty much is exactly 3 hours. It definitely does go for a different type of Gotham and Batman than we've seen in a live-action film before, and I think those who read a decent amount of comics will recognize a lot of the little flourishes and themes that are being used in the screenplay and what the whole production team is going after. So I think it has been a film that has appeased a lot of diehard comic fans, giving them something they recognize from the actual printed materials that has not necessarily turned up in a live action film before. And I think it has played well with general non-comic fans because, again, this is something they haven't seen before. So it builds off of what the Nolan trilogy did, which I'm not the biggest fan of. As people who know me very well know, I really don't have any use for the second and third films of the Nolan trilogy, but they do have their very vociferous fans, and their impact has been impossible to escape from in terms of every superhero comic book film adaptation that has come out since. So you can definitely feel some of that shared DNA. It was bound to happen with this new film, The Batman. But I think the usage and proper implementation of a lot of comic themes, not just the aforementioned two that everybody seems to pull one, Year One and Long Halloween, but a lot of more modern comic runs, which I will admit, I sort of dabble in Batman comics myself. I'm a Batman nerd, but I haven't read every single comic arc, and I really more dabble in comics. And when I read Batman comics, it's usually more of the gold and silver Bronze Age stuff with a little bit of modern stuff thrown in. So I will admit I didn't get as many of the modern references that some of the diehard fans would. And if you're interested in that, the Great Channel Superhero Stuff You Should Know did some great spoiler-free and then a heavy spoiler video identifying all of the pulls from various comic runs. I myself noticed I went in with what the trailers were indicating, and this being, an early story of Batman. I assumed that, again, going by what the trailers and everything was really hyping, I assumed they were going to pull heavily from Frank Miller's Batman Year One, and the whole look of the universe they were going for seemed very much like Seven Light. And the film is very dark, of course, so it feels right out of David Fincher. Going into the actual film, it is very much, they are definitely going for the Seven type atmosphere. It doesn't seem like they really admitted it, but it seems very plainly obvious. All you have to do is see one or two shots of this film, and you can definitely tell that they're trying to go into Fincherland territory, which does sort of dovetail with a lot of more modern Batman comics and the way that Gotham City is envisioned in those. So that makes sense to a degree. Again, like with everything, I myself would not have chosen some of the things that they went with, but that's just personal opinion. But what I was very surprised by is that they pulled less from year one and they pulled more from the famous The Long Halloween story, which really reinvigorated the mafia into Gotham and gave us the Carmine Falcone character that is now, popped up in all kinds of various scenarios, including Batman Begins as well. So it's not our first time seeing more of a mob presence inside of a live action Batman feature film, but this is definitely the heaviest of it. And it is reinvented to be less of the very heavily Godfather inspired mafia types we see in the Long Halloween original comic and the other Joseph Loeb, Tim Sale works. But it works within this universe. It's much more grounded. Now, I'm trying to keep this short and not start to ramble on into spoiler territory. So to keep everything nice and concise, I felt performance-wise, every member of the cast was great across the board. I don't think there were any issues there. And it was most surprising because when Robert Pattinson was announced as the new choice for Batman and Bruce Wayne, it just felt like that it wouldn't go well. And I think he's a fine actor, and I've been very surprised at the career choices he's tried to make to get away from being pigeonholed in one thing or another post-Twilight. And what he does with the role is very nuanced and much better than, again, what the hype and the lead up and the trailers would have you think. And I think it enmeshes perfectly with this version of Gotham and this particular take of Batman that does seem very much heavily inspired by several particular comic runs of the more modern era of DC Comics and the way that Batman has been redefined in different areas. So I think in terms of the Gotham that they have created in this film, and it is supposed to be part one of a new trilogy, and there are definitely several threads left out there and left open to weave into a possible second and third film. I think everything works, and I was very pleasantly surprised because I had major issues with the preceding Bat films, really starting with The Dark Knight. I mean, Batman Begins isn't perfect, but it's the last official live-action Batman film that I've actually not had gigantic qualms with. And then Dark Knight Rises, I thought was a total mess, and then the less said about the Zack Snyder films, the better. At least in my opinion. I know they have their fans, and that's perfectly fine. So it really, in short, I was pleasantly surprised that I enjoyed the film, and I do think it is good. I don't think it's I think it's definitely better than the films that have preceded it in the last few years. And I was surprised that there was a genuine feeling of the Dark Knight detective. Batman is actually shown doing a lot of detective work, but it is a bit one-sided because this is essentially a sort of year two Batman story. Batman is in his second year of vigilantism, but Bruce Wayne is pretty much non-existent and is reconfigured as this extremely wounded, reclusive character. You really only see him 2 or 3 times in the film, and it's a particular take that I have seen used in some comics, and it works in the universe they've created, but it does make everything feel a bit one-sided because all we are doing is pretty much getting to see Batman, and in that sense, it does kind of make you think of perhaps a video game adaptation. And when we see Bruce Wayne, it's like the handful of levels in, say, one of the Arkham games or a Spider-Man game, for example, where you have to walk around as a civilian identity and just do some button prompts, and all you want to do is get back to the levels where you're playing as Batman instead of Bruce Wayne. Which is understandable, but the whole film's focus is on Batman and the unending quest and pursuit that Bruce Wayne has put himself on, and so Bruce Wayne himself becomes pretty much non-existent. And we are very much adhering to the dual identity motif here, where the primary belief a lot of people have is that Bruce Wayne is the mask and Batman is the real person, which makes sense, and many adaptations have gone with that. I've always felt that's a bit simplistic. For me personally, the whole detective part of Bruce's brain never switches off, and if you want to split up the character into different sides, I think you really have to say that there's 3 sides, much like Zorro, who inspired Batman, and many other classic adventure characters. You not only have the civilian identity and the heroic identity, but you really have the third, which is the in-between, when Bruce or Batman, say, is in the Batcave and can just drop all the facades and be the normal, natural person with elements of both, and not having to put on a performance for either side of his personality spectrum, if you will. So that's just my own personal thing. I can see why it was done that way in this film, and it makes sense thematically. I do think that for the story that is being told, which is surprisingly pulling quite a bit from various comic runs, and then even more surprisingly, it seems like they pulled quite a bit from several video game adaptations. Particularly I only played the first season, but of the Telltale Games Batman Adventures series. There's quite a bit from that, and several moments, and not just plotting, but also some of the particular staging. It very much reminded me of that first season of that game series that I played, almost to the point where if you've played that and your actions determine how the story goes, it will continually cut away to characters and their reaction shots, and will say things like Alfred will remember that, or Harvey will remember that, and that meaning that your actions are already leading you to a particular outcome. Well, since they were seemingly inspired heavily by the Telltale game series, it made me think of that. And while I'm watching the film, and some character reaction shots, and I'm like, oh, Alfred will remember that. So, and I'm glad to see other people have picked up on that, and that it wasn't just me. So I feel, because I don't read every single comic that comes out, I always feel like I don't know enough when I'm starting to reference particular elements of the comic book realm of Batman, because my knowledge is very, very spotty, and so I always defer to others who are far better versed in the Bat mythos than I am, but I feel like I have a pretty decent understanding of things. So I was very much surprised to see them not just pulling from comic book runs, but also pulling from some of the video games and other aspects of the Bat mythos outside of just Bat films and the more famous comic book stories. So it definitely shows there was a creative team at the helm of this picture that actually knew something about Batman, which is rare, and actually cared to try and get some accuracy into the adaptation. I think that this also comes through in all of the little Easter eggs and nods that are all over the film to various parts of the Bat mythos, which, again, it was surprising to see. I know I didn't get all of them. It's impossible, I think, to get all of them in one viewing. But what surprised me most is that there are quite a number of nods, references, and visual nods to Batman 66. So that was a total surprise, because pretty much for my entire lifetime, Batman 66, until the past few years with the comics, the new toys, and then the Blu-ray release, it was like the ultimate no-no. You couldn't reference Batman 66 because it was too campy and too goofy and too light. So to see that pop up all over the place in the ultra gritty, dark, attempting to be highly realistic, the Batman, was a real surprise. So I think it definitely shows that you have a level of fandom inside the production that is something we haven't really seen before in any live action Batman film, I don't think. So that was very interesting and very surprising, and very, very pleasant to see. So there are things all over the 3-hour running time for Batman fans. Now, the big elephant in the room again is that 3-hour running time. I think for the story that's being told, I think they do a good job at getting their themes across. But the amount of actual story material is not enough to justify a 3-hour running time. I think the film is grossly too long. It also has, it has a decent 3-act structure, but it goes on and on and on, and has really multiple different endpoints. It seems to keep building and going and going, and it really goes on far too long, especially for the story that's being told. I think had things been more focused and more concise, I think the film would have been much more effective, and I'd say it's probably at least half an hour to maybe 45 minutes too long. And had, say, for example, in the classic studio system, or say in the years or decades ago, had you made the same story and used the same story beats, and you done it somehow in the studio system, it would be a 90-minute movie. 2 hours maybe. I think if the film was maybe a little over 2 hours, allowing for some extra flourishes and moments of isolation with Batman in his second year of crime fighting, I think if it was maybe more around 2 hours 15 minutes, maybe 2 hours 20 minutes, I think it would play better. Absolutely. My biggest problem with the film is that it is far too long for the story that it's telling. Again, there's nothing bad in it, but when you get to the end of 3 hours, and particularly after the multiple sequences that conclude the third act, and each one of them could be its own ending. For me, there's one point where I think the film really should have ended, and then it goes on for like another little sequence or two, and each of those could have ended the film. But I think it definitely goes on too long. The plot starts to really unspool at the end of that third act. But really, I'd say it starts to unspool in the second act, if I'm honest. Again, it's nothing bad, but it hurts the film's overall resonance, because when you get out of it, it's really a film that's kind of beaten you into submission. You go in and it starts to win you over, and you're able to go along with things, but because it is 3 hours long and it just keeps going and going and going, it really beats the audience into submission, and eventually you just throw up your hands and you go along for the ride and everything's fine. But I don't think it's possible to get as invested in the story being told or the characters on screen. That even goes to a lot of the villains, who are well portrayed, but I just didn't really become invested in anything that was going on. Colin Farrell's Penguin is just kind of there, and this is of course earlier in his career, where he's a lower level, or maybe a second tier in the overall mob corporate ladder, if you will, and so he doesn't have the lead villain presence. But really, he's just kind of there, and the focus continually shifts over to the film's version of the Riddler, which is recast in a sort of very much a serial killer type mold, and the riddles are left in the forms of clues at crime scenes and murder sites, and there's a very grisly feeling to it, which is something that has been done in comics in the past decade or two, where they always try to toughen up Ed Enigma, but for me personally, it just didn't really feel very much like the Riddler. It is very much a modern take on the idea of a character leaving riddles, but it very much leaves you with the feeling that when Batman is investigating these crime scenes, along with Gordon, and the overall very David Fincher type look and feel, it could be any sort of serial killer show, or where they're having to do a procedural to track down the insane twisted killer. So it just didn't really feel very much like the classical Riddler. And I know some people love this new approach. Some people, like myself, are not really fans of it, but it all makes sense in what they were going for. That's just more my own personal qualms, and I've always loved the Riddler the way he was, so it just didn't really sit well with me, but it works within the scheme of things. And Paul Dano's performance is great, although we don't really see him visually without a mask on until the very end. And when you get to that reveal, it's a particular take on the Edward Nygma character that then makes the whole serial killer type Riddler approach makes sense. And everything is very grounded. And that goes as well with the Zoe Kravitz version of Catwoman, which does have some parallels to the Year One story. They did use some of the classic Frank Miller Year One story through a little sprinkled throughout. But it also manages to do its own thing, which is nice and interesting, and gives Selena Kyle very much her needed duplicity, and you can never quite tell what her motivations are, which was nice to see in a Catwoman adaptation on the screen. But again, there's not a whole lot of resonance. Again, the 3 hour runtime really just sort of bashes everybody into submission, and you just go along with everything, and you get to the end of it, and you're like, oh, well, that was okay, but outside of trying to figure out what references there are, there's not a whole lot of resonance there, I don't think. I think it would have been much better if it could have been the same exact story, if it was much more focused and kept its narrative intact much better, and was much closer to a 2 hour, maybe 2 hour and 20 minute runtime. If it were me personally, I think it would actually be even better if it was maybe a little under 2 hours, if you were telling that same exact story. There is a sense that they were trying to give scale and a breadth to the length of the story, which definitely much fits in the choice to adapt The Long Halloween, which itself as a story takes place over a very long period of time. In the film, it's not really said how long the story takes place, but it's definitely not the sort of entire year that the long Halloween takes. So to do that and then it not take place over a very long span of time is a bit iffy, at least for me. Now, to get on to my other big issue, which I didn't really expect, but I probably should have. I went in thinking that I knew sort of what they were going for, and I was pleasantly surprised that they were pulling from other things and putting Batman nods all over. But what I could have done without were all of the pulls, references, lifts, and nods from a lot of classic 70s and 80s films, particularly crime dramas and iconic films of the 70s. This was something that the Joker film from a couple years ago did pretty much throughout its entire runtime and totally ruined that film for me. I think that film is really has nothing to do with the Joker. It's just they called the character that. And that film's constant lifting of even individual shots that were directly copied from other films. Everything from the obvious Scorsese influence of Taxi Driver and King of Comedy to direct lifts from The French Connection and even The China Syndrome really got infuriating. And again, it just made that film pointless to me. So I probably should have expected some of that in this, and you really can't escape that. Everybody's going to be influenced by something, which is perfectly fine. Even the comics are. Taxi Driver is almost always the number one thing that inspires most modern Batman stories because you have the lone figure haunted by personal demons in the dark underbelly of the city, and then essentially he becomes an urban hero of sorts by becoming a vigilante, although it's not really what he meant in the first place, if you remember what poor Travis Bickle's original plan was before that got foiled with the Senator Palantine and then Bickle going to rescue Iris from the sort of dragon-like figure of Harvey Keitel's sport. So that makes sense, and you pretty much have to come to expect the Taxi Driver influence in most any modern Batman story arc. So I knew that was gonna be there, but I didn't expect all of the little nods and pulls and sort of echoes in the writing and the construction from a lot of classic 70s films. So that runs the gamut from The French Connection to there's even little echoes of The Godfather, Taxi Driver, of course. There's some echoes of Chinatown, and these were all things that Matt Reeves and others have admitted and actually talked about as their inspiration. So it's not me just making connections simply from my own personal standpoint. These are actual things that they have said actually inspired the writing process. Another being that the Batman and Catwoman relationship was very much heavily inspired by the relationship between Jane Fonda's character and Donald Sutherland's character in the classic film Clute, which until that film was reissued by the Criterion Collection on Blu-ray a short while ago was much more on the obscure side and didn't really get referenced outside of film classes about the 70s and things. So now you're starting to see things like that pop up more often, which usually happens when films get rediscovered. But a lot of those I noticed right off the bat. There's also some other things from other films outside the 70s and 80s. Again, there's a lot of David Fincher type touches. There's a lot of Seven in this film, right down to the way that Gordon is very much poised in a lot of scenes, and it just makes you flash back to the Morgan Freeman character in Seven constantly. I also think with the setup of the mob characters and the way we first enter the Iceberg Lounge, things like that, there's very much a Goodfellas vibe, which they have admitted to, and it is very plain. So there's even a bit of Goodfellas in there. And so for me, that while it's understandable, because it's not really as woven into this universe and to the script as it should be, it sort of felt a bit jarring to me, and it took me out of the film experience. It's definitely much better integrated than it was in Joker, because Joker really didn't integrate any of the references. They were just direct lifts and steals. But in this film, it felt very much apparent. The phrase "wearing inspirations on its sleeve" is, well, they're not just on the sleeve; they're just all over. but they are at least somewhat integrated. But I will say I could have done without that. I much prefer it when inspirations are much better integrated into the story being told, and so you can recognize the parallels and the echoes instead of just while you're watching it take you out of the story because it's like, oh well, that's this and that's from the restaurant scene in The Godfather Part One, and you recognize specific little elements that make you just go, oh wait, oh whoa, oh, and you're taken out of the movie itself. So again, it's not bad, and not everybody's going to get this. But if you're a film geek, you are going to have a number of moments or instances where things are going to seem very, very familiar. And there's also quite a bit of Sidney Lumet in there as well, which is interesting. And that sort of ties into an old fan theory and an idea I've always loved, a what if. If you think about what if there could have been a serious Batman adaptation back in the 70s or 80s, probably stemming from the classic Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams reinvention of the character as the Dark Knight detective in the 70s, really bringing Batman back from the depths of the Silver and Bronze Ages, and getting Batman out of the silly comics of the 50s and out of the hip comics of the 60s finally. That could have translated into it as a film, and the number one name that really comes to mind in terms of dealing with the corrupt underbelly of a great metropolis is Sidney Lumet. And Lumet was a great fan of legitimate melodrama, and just the idea of Sidney Lumet directing a serious Batman film adaptation, probably in the early 80s. Perhaps even if he did the Tom Mankiewicz first Batman script that Mankiewicz wrote when they were trying to get the first film off the ground, that was really dated like 82, but more like 83, somewhere around there, and got shopped around to every studio over and over, which is a great script, which I think every fan should read. It is available online if you haven't read it. But even if Sidney Lumet just directed the Tom Mankiewicz script with some changes here and there, I think it would have been a phenomenal Batman film, and probably the best Batman film. It's just a great what if, but it got brought back to mind by seeing the Batman and seeing a lot of the influences that Matt Reeves was working with and putting into his script. And so I really do get that sense that the Sidney Lumet influence was there. And one film in particular keeps coming to mind, and the title of which is even in a line of dialogue. And that is, of course, the classic masterpiece Prince of the City that I have here behind me, that was recently released on Blu-ray by the Warner Archive. It's a must-own disc if you haven't gotten it already. It is really probably the best and truest film about police in a big city and police corruption. It has a long runtime and a great number of speaking parts that gets over 200 or 250 speaking roles in the film, and the film is pretty close to 3 hours. It's 167 minutes, so it's a little shorter than The Batman, but as a narrative, it is brilliantly constructed to keep the main character in focus at all times and his own personal demons that develop over the course of the film. But it's also a great narrative that you can just sink yourself into. You get caught up in this world, ripped from real life stories and a great book that came out before the film. But the actual script does a brilliant job of keeping everything in focus and pacing it perfectly over the long runtime, so you really get the impact of what this is doing to the central character played by the great Treat Williams. So I think this film was a huge influence on the Batman, whether they want to admit it or not. It has been said that because this film was intended to be sort of the start of a new Bat franchise, and it is going to spin off several shows on HBO Max, one of which was supposed to be a show about the corrupt police in Gotham. And Matt Reeves and others have expressly said that it was going to be very heavily inspired by Prince of the City. Well, now that series has apparently been canceled, and we're just going to get a Penguin spinoff show with the Colin Farrell Penguin, and then a second show, I believe, about Arkham. I can't remember exactly what the second show is about, but this film is going to not only spawn 2 sequels, apparently, but also at least 2 spin-off shows, and will be sort of a sister series franchise to the new relaunching of a new DC universe under the Warner Brothers banner. So Warner Brothers is putting a lot into this, and I think that's why they let them have a 3-hour runtime. But it is also setting up a lot of things that are supposed to then be carried on in other series and shows and spin-offs and sequel films. So It also makes sense then why I think it is a bit disjointed and overlong. But I think the Prince of the City DNA is definitely there in this film, even though they've only talked about it in terms of the canceled show. But if you know Prince of the City and you know its runtime, you know its very epic scale and all the different speaking parts and how it shows a character's real disintegration over a period of time based on their own choices and what that does not just to themselves but to everyone around them and the city itself. I think it becomes very much apparent that you get a lot of that in the Batman as well. So again, that's not a bad thing. I think it's just being able to identify where things are being pulled from. And before the line "Prince of the City" was actually used in the film, I just kept thinking, this does feel quite a bit like Prince of the City, and then Bruce Wayne is referred to literally as, "Oh, there's the Prince of the City." So I'm like, "Oh, well, there you go." It's actually in one of the lines of dialogue. So really, in short, I know I've said this is going to be a short video, but unfortunately, I always start to ramble. I have made sure to keep this spoiler free, so if this helps convince you to check the film out, I would recommend it to all Batman fans. I do think it is the best Batman film in quite a number of years. I think the core of the character is intact, which I was very pleasantly surprised by. Usually everything is always dark for darkness' sake, and especially in the Nolan films, I do think you lost quite a bit of the core of the Batman character, especially in the second film and most of all the third film, which I really this film is much better than Dark Knight Rises. I will say that. And in some ways, I do think it is better than The Dark Knight, which I'm not really a fan of. So I think this is the best attempt anyone has made in a live action Batman film in a long time. I think that Matt Reeves and company did some interesting things and took the character and the world of Gotham in some into some areas that we've not seen in a live action film. And I really did appreciate the heavy usage of comic story arcs and direct references without just going back to the same four or five that everybody pulls from because they're the most famous ones. I do think it could have done with a more tightly focused screenplay. I think the narrative does start to fizzle out in places in the second act, and especially by the third act. I think the film goes on quite a way too long for the story it's telling. I think it's probably about at least 30 to perhaps 45 minutes too long in terms of the overall pacing. I don't know exactly what you could cut. I think a lot from the third act could go, or at least be simplified. But I think if the film was playing at 2 hours to maybe 2 hours 15, 2 hours 20, I think it would be a lot more effective, and you could get in more showtimes in a day because the film was shorter, and everybody would be happier because the Warner Bros. Would be making more money, theaters would be making more money, so on and so forth. I did notice in the screening I went to, there were some people that did fall asleep. Admittedly, it was a late show, but and then you could tell people were affected by the length. But the overall impact has been pretty positive, which was surprising. And once I started hearing that stuff filtering through the fan base, it finally convinced me to go because, again, the trailers really didn't give me any interest in going. I will say my biggest personal qualm, though, is the usage of Nirvana's Something in the Way, which was used in the trailer. Apparently, that was the key song that Matt Reeves was listening to while he was writing or working on the screenplay, and so he put it in the film. And, I mean, it makes sense, but it just felt it was the most jarring thing in the film for me because I am a big Nirvana fan. But I think when you start referencing the outside world, it does start to take away from the immersion into a Batman story in Gotham, and I mean, it works thematically. I've never been a fan of needle drops for needle drop's sake, and unless they're really, really well done, they really take me out of a film. I think it's a very delicate art form, the art of putting a needle drop of a song into a movie and it not ruining the whole universe that's being created. And again, it makes sense thematically, and I guess the Robert Pattinson Batman is driving around listening to Something in the Way on repeat, apparently. But it is used twice. They use it at the beginning and they use it at the end. I really wish they had not used it at the end. If they were going to use it, the once was fine. Again, it's sort of like the unofficial theme song of the film and this particular iteration of the Batman at this point in time in his year 2 of crime fighting. So it is my one nitpick, but it really did stick with me, and I really wish it just hadn't been used at all, because that's one of the great songs from one of the greatest albums ever made, and it just felt really weird seeing that in a Batman film. The Michael Giacchino score is actually it's quite good in places. I was surprised that there was an actual underscore going on. I think the themes he came up with Catwoman were a bit reminiscent of the Danny Elfman Batman Returns Catwoman theme, but I just wish the score had more presence. I mean, it's there. I think its presence is more felt in the quieter character scenes or the interiors, but thankfully it wasn't just the generic Hans Zimmer noises all over the place that a lot of the past few films have been using since the Nolan film trilogy happened. So it's okay, but I don't think it had enough of an impact to really register, unfortunately, which is kind of my overall impression of the film. I think it does share some of the same deficiencies that I felt were in the two Matt Reeves Planet of the Apes reboot films, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and War for the Planet of the Apes, which I felt were both way too overlong and didn't have properly focused narratives. I think this film is an improvement on those two. I think it has some of the same problems, but I do think it is more fine-tuned and a little bit more focused, and the central character, you have a central character to follow, whereas those two films I think were even more fractured. So it is nice to see that there is some improvement on the issues I have with those two reboot films, but I think there are some of the same issues still there in The Batman. So ultimately, I was pleasantly surprised. I go into everything with an open mind, even though I know I'm probably not going to like something. And I will admit that with Batman films, I am much more persnickety, because I am a Batman fan, and I really don't enjoy a lot of the dark for darkness sake that has been going on with the character for the past few decades. And although I do like dark Batman stories just fine, but I really do feel that a lot of the dimensionality of the character has been lost or honed down, and it's something you really only see nowadays in certain comic runs where they are allowed to try different things. So it was nice to see more reference to the actual comic works in a live action film, that you got a sense of it was made by Batman fans and that everybody was putting real effort into it. So I think it has been it's a marked improvement over all the Batman films we've gotten from Warner Brothers in the past few years, which really, once you include Suicide Squad and all the other stuff, I think they were pretty dire. So it was nice to be pleasantly surprised that I didn't hate it. I found things to like in it. I could have done without all of the very obvious pulls and references and echoes of classic 70s and 80s films, but all in all, I think it's actually relatively solid, and it will be interesting to see where they go with a second and third film. I don't really think it needed to be a trilogy, but I think particularly with this first sequel that they'll be working on, because the film has been very successful so far, I think it'll be very interesting to see where they go with it. I hope it doesn't run 3 hours, but seeing as this went okay, I'm sure it probably will have a more bloated runtime again. But ultimately, it'll be interesting to see where they go with it. And I will say it's the first time I've actually not hated my experience with a new Batman film in a very long time. So with that, if you've seen the film, please leave any comments you have below, or if you're interested in seeing the film, or if you thought it was nice to see certain comic ideas pulled and used in a live action film. I'd love to talk with you guys about it. It's a lot to digest. I know a lot of fans there have already seen it multiple times, and the 3-hour runtime does make it hard to get everything on that first viewing. So I know it will be a film revisited by many once it hits streaming services and gets a disc release. So as always, thank you ever so much for watching.